should I have
Welcome to Media Path. I'm Fritz Coleman.
And I'm Louise Palanker.
Here on Media Path Podcast, we like to call your attention to interesting new finds from the entire media landscape. There is so much new content lately, you don't have time to browse everything. So we handpick a couple of items and deliver them right to you, kind of a cultural Instacart. That's our job. George Santos said, Media Path helped me factualize my resume. We also bring you fascinating guests. Today, we have a bounty of riches. We have two authors. Anybody who is a fan of the films from the New Hollywood will know how important a role Karen Black played in those films, like Easy Rider, Five Easy Pieces, some of my favorite movies of all time. If so, you will be inspired by this story. Karen gave up a child for adoption when she was only 19 years old. Years later, the young woman who is her daughter, Diane Bay, set out to research and find her biological mother, and she's written a memoir about her search and her finding and the warm bonding with her mother, Karen Black. It's called Finding Karen Black, Roots to Wings. We're going to talk to Diane and a close family friend of Karen's, Lee Purcell, in just a few minutes. Plus, to say our economy has been on a roller coaster in the last decade is an understatement. Well, as it turns out, past is prologue. Writer Richard Farley, in his latest book called Gonzo Wall Street, talks about the Wall Street in the 60s and what's to be learned from the hair-raising 60s concerning our money markets now. But first, Wheezy, what do you have for us?
Well, I've been doing some reading, Fritz. You know how I do.
You always do.
I read a book called Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. Elizabeth Zott is a fierce, logical, and brilliant chemist, but she's a gifted chemist in the 60s when her male teachers, colleagues, and bosses want to either take credit for ideas or simply take her without consent or recourse. Ever resourceful, Elizabeth fends off a groping hand by stabbing it with a pencil. Out of work and on her own raising a daughter, Elizabeth's impressively distinctive personality leads to an opportunity for her to host an afternoon cooking show, which she customizes into a platform to teach and empower women through the unapologetic truth of chemistry. Lessons in Chemistry is a New York Times bestseller with 90,000 reviews on Amazon.
That sounds really cool.
It's a great book.
Nobody thinks of cooking as chemistry. That's
Right.
why I'm bad
It
at
is
cooking
chemistry.
and at chemistry, because
Well, read this book. You'll get closer to your goal.
I want to talk about another book. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Dear.
No, I just was going to ask you what you've been...
I read a book this week, and it's from one of my favorite humans on the planet, John Meacham. It's And There Was Light. It's Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle. I'm a huge fan of John Meacham. He's a presidential historian. He's an author. He's a professor at Vanderbilt University, occasional speechwriter for President Biden. The last book of his I read was called The Soul of America, which was like salve on our national wounds, because it proved that regardless of how bad things are politically in this country right now, we have been there before. That's the kind of book this Lincoln book is, too. A great book for this tumultuous era. It's a deep dive into the life of the 16th president. Although he wasn't a particularly religious man, he was very spiritual. He was known as the Redeemer in Chief. The book focuses on his moral compass. Lincoln said it wasn't about sitting around waiting for God to tell you what to do. It was about just listening to your conscience. I've read several books about Lincoln, but this one really exposes what a conflicted relationship he had with both his mother and his father. Although his often troubled relationship with them and his often troubled relationship with Mary Todd Lincoln really formed who he was. Morality seems like it's gone from politics these days, but it wasn't back then. Lincoln believed that politics in a democracy was a cross between compromise and moral principle. The part that will catch your imagination is the atmosphere in our country in like 1860 to 1861, just before the Civil War. It's hauntingly familiar with the environment we're in today. Irreconcilable politics, racism, just the tension, and the way Lincoln was able to navigate the toxic atmosphere. You'll find yourself saying, Abe, where are you when we need you? John Meacham. It's a wonderful book. I like it.
I want to read it.
Yeah.
It's very good.
I want to read it.
I love books about history.
We can always turn to Abe for inspiration.
Right now, we're going to learn a little bit. Karen Black, an iconic actress of what was referred to as the New Hollywood, when eclectic independent films were taking over. She was an actor and a screenwriter and a singer and a songwriter. Some of the groundbreaking films she appeared in were Easy Rider, Five Easy Pieces, Airport 75, The Great Gatsby, Nashville, Day of the Locust. These are like seminal movies. She was also way ahead of her time by playing a trans woman in 1982. She was cast by Robert Altman in the Broadway play called Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean. Karen had a child at 19 years old who, because of difficult circumstances in her life, had to give her up for adoption. And after years of yearning and wondering and researching, she was finally reunited with that child, who is Diane Bay, who is with us today from Kentucky via Zoom. Diane has written a really moving memoir about rediscovering her mother called Finding Karen Black, Roots to Wings. Diane, we're so happy to have you with us today. Thank you. And thank you for this book. It's quite touching.
You're welcome, and I'm pleased to be here. Okay.
Well, I'm going to introduce your friend and Karen's close friend. In the studio, we have Karen's, I guess, best friend, is safe to say, right?
Best friend.
A talented actress and a director, Lee Purcell. She's a 2-time Emmy nominee. She was mentored by Steve McQueen. Ain't bad work if you can get it. Worked with John Voight, Nick Cage, Orson Welles, Gene Wilder, and R.I.P. Chadwick Boseman. What did you do with Chadwick?
I did a series with him called Persons Unknown.
Oh, man, what a waste. What a beautiful, talented man.
Well, he wasn't. I just want to correct you on that, if you don't mind. I know what you mean when you say what a waste, because he left us so young. But he left such a massive body of work.
And I watched Ma Rainey's Black Bottom again the other night. That was a monumental performance.
And he was dying when he did that.
I know he was. He was very thin.
Very thin.
Anyway, let me finish your
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Talk about me.
You have many film and TV credits. Lee played a prominent role in Karen's life and is really part of the memoir. And so, Lee, just before we bring in Diane to put all of this in perspective, when did your relationship start with Karen?
Well, Karen and I met a very Hollywood kind of meeting. We were doing an afternoon talk show that Johnny Grant, if you remember.
Oh, of course.
So Johnny Grant.
The Prince of Hollywood.
The Prince of Hollywood, who has a street named after him right there. He was doing an afternoon talk show at that time, and we both were sent to the show by our respective publicists. I think it was Karen's second or third film, and it was my first film. And it was shot outside. The show was, and we had like chairs and we were kind of walking around the grass. It was a very interesting show, and we were introduced, and we just looked vastly different because I looked kind of like a Barbie doll because I had been done up by the team, and Karen looked like a hippie. And she was wearing, I don't know, like an assortment of scarves and hair pieces and 2 or 3 pair of eyelashes and kind of floated, and we just went, oh my God, both of us to each other. And it was an interesting meeting because
you knew you were soulmates immediately.
We were, yeah. It was like that.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
It was like you finally find this person again.
And you were very close to her all her life, and were there in particular toward the end of her life when she was very close to her death, and were supportive of the family, and supportive of Diane, and supportive to Karen's whole family. There's a touching moment when you get sort of reunited with Karen's son.
Yeah, Hunter. He's my godson.
Yeah, and so it's very lovely. So anyway, we've set the stage, Diane. I'm going to let Wheezy talk, but I did want to say that there are endless adoption stories, and a couple of them from my family, where an adopted child goes in search of their biological parents, and the search and the discoveries can be very complicated. Yours was not. Yours was uplifting, and I'm guessing it went the way you dreamed it would go when you started. Am I right?
Oh, I didn't have any reservations about searching when I was young, but I never, after getting to be a teenager, I didn't have expectations. I didn't know how it would go at all. In fact, I hesitated for several months before I sent in my forms because I was just really nervous about what might happen. So what actually did happen was incredible and just blew me away.
So for those of us who have been raised by our birth parents, I don't think we have a full understanding of how wrenching and primal is the need to ascertain a biological connection. And you described that so beautifully for people like me that were, that had the blessing of being raised by birth parents and knowing this is genetically, who I come from. But your search for it, and then ultimately your finding of it, is just absolutely harrowing. And I know Fritz said it went pretty well, but there are moments along the way where you're just on your knees. So a lot went on. So talk about the first moment you're holding in your hand the identification of your mother's name, and take the story from there a little bit for us.
Sure. So I was by the mailbox and I finally saw her name, and I was super glad to see it because I wasn't sure if it was going to be there. And then I went right to my computer and I, of course, Googled the name because that's what you do. And right away, all these links popped up, and the very first one was this Wikipedia link. So I clicked on it, and here's this famous actor that I knew who she was. And in fact, I had been in the movie theater when I was like 14 years old watching The Great Gatsby, not knowing I was watching my own mother.
Oh my gosh.
And so I clicked on it and I thought, well, this can't be right. No way. I'll just read it just to make sure that, it's not real. And all of the facts just lined up. And my stomach was just turning, and I got chills all over, and I clicked back to Google, and I'm realizing, well, all of these links are about her. So I didn't know what to think. And I called my husband and I said, well, I think I might've just found my mom in like 2 seconds. It's supposed to take months or years, And of course, this was before all the DNA stuff came out. So
okay.
It's another whole story.
Yeah.
But so I said, well, what should I do? Do you think I could try to find her address or something? And he goes, well, is she on Facebook? Oh, well, sure, she'll be there. And I sat back down and I messaged her on her fan mail message Facebook page, and that's as quick as it was.
It's great. You mentioned your husband. One of the touching parts of the book was to find out how emotionally invested he was in your journey. When you were weeping, he was weeping before you were weeping at what you discovered and the direction it took. It was so touching, and how supportive he was throughout the whole process.
Thank you. Yeah.
So
I agree.
you, so many interesting parts of this. The difference between the life that your biological mother was leading in Hollywood and the life that you were growing up in, we'll call it a middle-class life, in Illinois and Kentucky. Describe what your life was like before you discovered your biological mother, and describe your relationship with your adoptive parents.
Okay. Well, I grew up in what used to be called a white-collar, middle-class family. My father was a speech pathologist, and my mom was a stenographer. But then when I was 5, she had what they used to call a nervous breakdown. And of course, this was before antidepressants and talk therapy and everything that we have now to deal with this kind of thing. So she ended up in the hospital on terrible meds, and she was a mess for a long time. So not only did I not have my birth families, I did not have my other roots, that I didn't have any grandparents that I looked like, or aunties to, tell me stories, nothing. And I also didn't have a maternal link with my adoptive mother for many years. So that was really difficult. So, but I had a really good relationship with my father. So that was the big blessing in my life, how great he was for me. And he really stepped up when my mom had so many problems to raise me and my sister. So that was really good.
Right. And then you step into this Hollywood land and, you're walking very carefully at first, but you find that everyone is quite loving and also more emotionally expressive than what you had experienced. And so it was quite a revelation. Talk about that a bit.
Yes, it was so fascinating to just be in the room with these creative people, because my parents were pragmatic people, and I married into a pragmatic family.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't surrounded with creative people at all. So to just sit there and just be surrounded and listen to the banter and the creative throwing ideas back and forth among them. It was eye-opening and wonderful.
Before we came to the studio, Weezy and I were having a conversation about how beautifully your book was written. I said, I wonder if she had a ghostwriter with her. And Weezy said, no, I think she's very creative, and because she had great creativity on both her biological mother and biological father's side. So she was channeling all this energy and finally had a way to use it. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense, I believe.
Right.
Yes,
but you were also painting and you were writing poetry your whole life with just no one really to share it with who understood the gift and the joy that it was for you.
Yes,
if I can throw in something.
Oh, sure.
Please, Lee, you're irritating now. You just keep talking.
I know. I just chatterbox. I can't shut up. What can I say?
Well,
but
Lee Purcell really took me under her wing. When I first went out there, she was one of the first people I met, and she was just lovely to me. She was like my grounding.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I was going to say that, I was experiencing the reverse of this, in that all those years, and it's in the book, all those years that they were apart. Karen talked about her, and like, where is she, and is she happy, and did she get a good family, is she alive, what is she doing? And every year around Diane's birthday, Karen would get very sentimental and kind of
And we ought
sad.
to say that Karen searched for you as you were searching for her, right? So there was a longing on her side of the equation.
Oh, there was a
as well.
huge, but it was a different kind of longing. And I encouraged her to go on the National Adoption Registry. And she thought about it for a long time, and then she decided not to. And I said, well, why not? Because if she's there, then you will connect. And she said, because I'm scared. What if she's going to hate me? Mm-hmm. What if she doesn't want anything to do with me? Mm-hmm. What if she's upset because I had to give her up? And so she didn't do that. And then when, this part just kills me, but the day came when Karen called me, and she could barely speak, and she just said, "I found her."
Oh my!
And I was like, I'm like, you found who? And she said, well, she found me. I said, who? And she said, my daughter. And it was, now she has another daughter, Celine, who's an adopted daughter.
As well.
Yeah.
But and I was speechless, because I had been through this journey with her for all those years, and we were both we were staggered. We were just. It was so shocking and so incredible. And I said, okay, so what's next? And she said, she's coming out here. Like,
what was so beautiful in the book was how her friends like you and her family immediately embraced Diane.
Immediately.
There was no transitional period where we're a little standoffish to see. They bathed her in warmth, and it was really lovely. I mean,
we were thrilled.
It was very evolved. You know what I mean?
I guess so, but I was so happy because I'd heard about it for 30-something, 40-something years, and then to have it there, and then she, oh my gosh, and she walked she was there in Karen's house, and it was almost like an apparition, and she was beautiful. Look at her, and she does have resemblance to both of her parents, to her biological father, and who's a great guy and who accepted her immediately, and to Karen, and then when I saw them just talking and painting together, it was really, really something.
Yeah, it opened a door to healing her soul in the places, the way you describe it in the book, and you're so lyrical and eloquent in your language. It's almost poetic. All of your prose are very poetic, but the puzzle pieces that were scattered come together to make a picture, because you're able to see why you are you, this search for identity that we're all on, right? But for you it was more fractured. And describe the healing of knowing these folks and getting connected with your dad and your brother and your sisters. And
my father's side of the family was just as welcoming. And my biological father is still alive, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying so. His name is Robert Benedetti, and he's a guy who's been behind the scenes in Hollywood a long time. He was with Ted Danson and his production company. He lived in the LA area a long time. He was dean of Cal Arts, and he told his kids about me when they were teenagers. So, like Lee was talking about, they always knew also. So they were all like, "Oh my goodness, here she is. We finally get to meet her."
And you said that his biological son looks very much like your son.
Yeah. One of my boys has the Italian genes, I guess, more than others. And when I first met Ben, too, he had my eyes. Like my brother Ben and I have the same eyes. They're even a little off kilter in the same way. That was spooky and really cool.
Yeah.
Your father told you that you were adopted at a fairly young age. And I'm wondering how difficult it was, first of all, to get the concept of adoption and how that affected your life from that point forward. It seemed like you were 6 or 7 years old, right, when he told you were adopted?
I was 4.
Oh,
I was
Lord
4
heavens.
because we were going to adopt my baby sister. So he used that to explain it to me. And I really didn't understand much. But what he said to me was, well, the stork brought you to her, but she couldn't keep you, so she gave you to us. And so to me, at 4-year-old brain, I knew about that stork, so that made sense to me.
Yeah, the stork just stopped at the wrong house. Right. And, you get a letter for your neighbor and you take it over,
But and Weezy made this great point earlier, talking about your identity and trying to find your place on the planet, not knowing your biological roots. You said that you had always, even from that young age to the point where you discovered your mom, you always wondered what you looked like. Growing up without knowing your people, it was impossible to feel like someone. That's very profound. And then another time you had a sort of the same emotion is when you were walking through Karen's home and you were looking at these pictures on her wall of all the members of your family, and you finally felt connected to the planet because there was your history, sort of an Ancestry.com hanging from the walls in her house. I mean, that to me gave me goosebumps when I read it.
I really feel strongly about that. I think because most people don't even understand how much their identity is formed by those around them, whether or not they end up having a really good relationship with their parents and siblings when they're grown. Those foundational years, you're looking in the mirror and you're seeing a little bit of your mom, maybe your grandma, your dad. You're seeing you're moving the same way. And what was one of the really weird things is that I moved just like Karen. It was really spooky to watch her move and do things and sit and everything just like me.
Right.
So, but I think that people that grow up in a traditional situation where they know their biological relatives I don't think that it means so much to them, but it is really foundational. And other adoptive people have said to me that they understand what I mean when I said I couldn't see myself.
Right. And I think it's even,
don't know what you look like.
Yeah, it's even more profound coming from your direction, because for those of us who grow up with our genetic relatives, we're striving to differentiate ourselves. We're striving to be unique. and you're searching for the similarities. So it's these push-pulls of life, right?
Right.
Lee, we want to get the opinion of an objective third party here. You've known
I feel
Karen.
like I'm an insurance agent.
Well, we're going to check the actuary
the
tables here and
damage.
see if what you're saying is true. But knowing her for this period of time, seeing her physically and knowing her character traits, what are her similarities with Karen?
Oh, boy, that's a really interesting. Put me on the spot. Well,
I mean, she felt like she had similarities, but do you notice it as an outsider?
I do. I don't think that Diane's eyes look like Ben. I think that Diane's eyes look like Karen. They are a different color. Karen had very sky blue eyes. Mm-hmm. But the shape of their eyes, and there was a really, and it's in the book, and when we finally make the movie or the miniseries, whatever it's going to be from the book, this scene will be in it because it's a great scene. But when Karen, because Diane is not like a makeup-aholic. Like, that's putting it mildly.
She can stop at any time.
She can stop. But Karen and we were always experimenting and as roommates and so forth. But so there was a time where Diane wanted to, I don't know, you can tell the story better than I do, but Karen taught Diane how to do her eye makeup, which was easy for Karen because they had the same shape eyes. And I thought that was an incredibly sweet and powerful, they only had a year together.
Exactly a year.
Yeah, exactly 1 year from August 8th.
And the Shakespearean third act of this whole thing is that you reestablished a relationship with your mom, and you were there to usher her to the other side, which was a gift to both you and her. It sort of completed her life and your life. And I mean, honestly, not to trivialize it, but it sounds like a screenplay. It sounds like
it is actually going to be a screenplay.
Oh, well, see there, I'm brilliant.
Because it is. I mean, the three of us. We have it's Diane and me and our partner Carrie Kosloff.
Carrie's here. He's our studio audience. He's playing the part of our studio audience.
Yes, Carrie is a literary agent, and he was Karen's literary agent towards the end of her life. And so the three of us have a partnership, and we will be doing either a feature or a limited series. And
what a great idea!
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Will you get to play your mom in this thing?
No. No, it'll be a Hollywood actress.
Well, before we close, I want to talk a little bit about the theme of melancholy, that you kind of identify a terminology for this feeling that you've had your whole life, sitting up in a tree and having this profoundly joyful sadness that overwhelmed you. And you define it, and I was thinking that maybe it's a hope in the yearning because of the possibility of its fulfillment, so that you kind of identify that there's a need, and that identification steers you towards finding what you need, as if you knew in some way that it wasn't just purely sad. Talk about that for a moment.
Yes, I had this feeling all my life, and it was almost solace for me. It's sad and sweet. I guess bittersweet is the term. Mm-hmm. And I never understood it until I had a profound experience with Karen. Lee, you probably were there. It was Academy Awards 2012 at Andy Timoner's house, where her and Azalea Snail were on the piano and they were singing together. And Stephen randomly posted it in October when I was already knowing Karen, and it just tore my soul apart. And I didn't know what to make of it. So I started journaling and trying to figure out what happened. What I realized is that I really had a lot of anger issues toward Karen. I didn't know it at the time. I never felt angry toward her ever, but it started coming out. And as I worked through it, I figured out that this melancholy was actually what the adoption community calls the primal wound, which is this separation at birth from your mother that's just so traumatic that adopted people sometimes never get over it. But I had that, but then I also had some type of memory of being in Karen's womb. And so there was this warm memory that I had carried with me all my life, wrapped in this sadness. And it was Karen. Mm-hmm. And she had been with me all my life.
Right. And there's a prenatal,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just if, we wonder when babies are gestating, what do they know, or what are they feeling? Are they?
I think they know everything.
Yeah,
everything.
Yeah. And then they come out and they have to be human like the rest of us.
Yes, that's right.
But you heard her singing for 9 months. You heard that voice. Go ahead, Fritz.
Yeah.
Before this gets away from us, you're a beautiful writer. You have a great gift, and you're a great poet. And there's a poem in there that really resonated with me called Ember or Embers. Have you got your poems memorized? Would I put you on the spot if I were to ask you to read that? Because it so describes your feelings in your journey. Do you mind reading that?
I have my book here. I don't know what page it is exactly.
It's available on Amazon.com if you're...
All right. Okay. I got it. This was written right after I had figured out this idea that Karen had been with me all my life. Okay, it's called Ember. How could you deny me you? All these years, the vast empty places echo where you belonged. Your song rips through my heart, unstops a hardened place not known before. There it is, you abandoned me. I should have joined your song, the song that completes me, that touches me like fire in my bones. But you did not know your fire followed me. I have been an ember when I could have been a flame. God, give me time, please, please, sweet time. Help me to forgive her. I have just found my life.
Oh, God.
Lord have mercy. Have you published your work?
It's right there.
No, it's published. It's in this book, but I mean like a freestanding book of your poems, because you really have a great gift.
And she's a great painter as well. She's a tremendous
I know. Another
painter.
Touching part of the story was when you got to paint that mural with your mom on the side of Karen's house, which was like your final artistic collaboration with your mom.
Yeah.
That was really beautiful.
So before we let you go, what can you share with us about where to find what you're doing and where we can find a movie if it's to be?
Okay.
I'll let Lee talk about the video aspect of things. I don't know that much about it, but I have 2 websites. I have DianeBay.com where I have my paintings, and I have FindingKarenBlack.com with information on the book. I'm on Facebook also. Those two things, Diane Bay Artist and Finding Karen Black on Facebook too.
All right, we'll have all of this in our show notes. And Lee, how about you? Where can folks find you?
Well, let me just say, Fritz mentioned it a moment ago. I just want to say the book is available on Amazon.com, and it is called Finding Karen Black, Roots to Wings, and it's a great read, I know, because I read it from the very first draft onward, and it is a really great read. And like I mentioned earlier, we are putting together a movie or a limited series, we're not quite sure what yet, based on the book. And give us time, and we will post all of that information. My website is it's LeePurcell.com is my website.
And before we go, talk about your theater project, which is awesome. I love theater on radio and theater.
Sure, yeah. I'm in addition to being, an actress in film and television and on the stage, I'm also a radio play nerd, and I produce with a partner a group called HollywoodRadioPlayers.com, and we do classic radio plays from the golden age of radio, which was the 30s through the 50s, pretty much 54 it ended. And we have a company, the Hollywood Radio Players Company. There we are. There's our thing, which I have to rewrite. I'm also the writer. But I don't write the plays, obviously. But there are some plays right there that we have up. We have 6. And what is exciting about our group, our company, and our shows is that it's radio that you can see. And because we created a way of doing this on Zoom. We use very sophisticated special effects, sound effects, music. We do era-specific costumes, even though you only see us from the chest up, but it's all specific.
How fun.
Yeah, it's really, really fun. And again, it's HollywoodRadioPlayers.com. We're also on YouTube, Facebook, et cetera, and there you see our members. And we are about to post our 7th show. We'll be posting that in February. But right now we have all those shows up, and they are really great shows, I have to say.
Thank you so much for being here. You really added a three-dimensional aspect of learning about Karen and her daughter. Diane, thank you so much. Now go scrape your windshield.
She's in icy Kentucky today.
Yeah.
Oh, Diane, it was just
You were awesome. A beautiful book. I hope it brings you enormous success.
It will.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Book.
Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Do we have victim number 2?
Survivor number 1 is leaving.
I want you to leave. It was a pleasure to get to know you.
Yeah, and we'll be talking.
Okay, I hope so.
Oh, yeah, we will.
There we go.
And we swap out the books, and here comes Rich. This is our graceful handoff. You are a joy.
So much.
Richard Farley is a great writer and has his finger on the pulse of Wall Street. He wrote a great book earlier about Wall Street. And here's his latest one called Gonzo Wall Street, Riots, Radicals, Racism, and Revolution. How the go-go bankers of the 60s crashed the financial system and bamboozled Wall Street. Richard, so nice to have you.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
You talk about the corruption of the banking system in the 60s. How was the banking system corrupt back then?
Well, you've got to think about the banking system in a bifurcated sense, because these were the days of Glass-Steagall, when you had the commercial banking system and the investment banking system. And the investment banking system dealt with mergers and acquisitions advice and stock trading and underwriting stocks and bonds and what today we would call private equity. And that was where most of the corruption took place. The commercial banking system was much more highly regulated and was much more low-flying as compared to the high-flying that went on in the investment banking industry. The other difference was commercial banks had real regulators. They had the OCC, the Federal Reserve, state banking regulators. Investment banking in those days had self-regulation, which meant the principal regulator for most of the investment banking community was the New York Stock Exchange. And while the SEC certainly was a regulator that dealt with a great many things, in the story I tell, which is a story of how insolvent investment banks were allowed to continue to operate, ultimately resulting in a financial crisis, the solvency of investment banks was regulated by the New York Stock Exchange, which was really a club. Mm-hmm. And the SEC and Congress, which should have been a lot more aggressive in keeping an eye on what the New York Stock Exchange did, instead had a very laissez-faire, hands-off approach. And that was the root of the problem.
And it's interesting you point out the lax regulation of the SEC. I think we saw that as recently as the Madoff scandal, where 4 or 5 times the SEC was made aware of this malfeasance, but because of the politics of the SEC, and that's another thing I want to talk to you about, the politics of it, they weren't able to, they never prosecuted him or never dove deep until this thing just, the head on this boil popped and it was an international scandal.
Right. It was a similar lapse in regulatory oversight, but in this case, for different reasons. Although politics certainly played a role, as you see in the book. The SEC under President Kennedy came up with a in-depth study of Wall Street with a view towards coming up with the remedies to bring forward the securities laws, the federal securities laws, which were passed in the 1930s. And not much really happened between the 1930s and the 1960s. And Kennedy, whose father, Joe Kennedy, was the first chairman of the SEC, thought there was potential problems as a result of Washington not having a good idea of actually what was going on. And that study brought forth a lot of very good reforms. What it didn't focus on was how shaky the capital structure was for most of the investment banks, including some of the largest.
It gets so intricate that folks on Capitol Hill don't necessarily understand all the intricacies and all the different ways that you can cheat and that you can leverage, et cetera. And or folks on Capitol Hill are getting rich off of the laxness.
Well, in this case, it wasn't getting rich. In this case, there was a sense after the Kennedy study was done, and in 1964, when amendments to the securities laws were passed, that this was the end of it, that we were done, and we had done what was necessary to protect investors for another 30 years. And what happened shortly after 1964? Well, you had Vietnam, you had riots in the streets, you had major distractions away from Wall Street, so that the attention of policymakers in Washington really moved away from Wall Street to other areas of profound concern. And when that pivot happened in 1964, that was when it happened to coincide with the largest bull market in history at that point. I'm sorry.
You go ahead, finish your thought.
Right. You had a massive increase in stock trading. You had a massive mergers and acquisitions wave with the conglomerate mergers that really exploded around that time. You had enormous amounts of IPOs in the hot new issue market. It started what was referred to as the go-go era. And that really took place at a time when Washington thought it had created a very safe regulatory regime for Wall Street, when in fact it hadn't.
And at the end of that wave, like 1970, according to your book, that's when we came up with a phrase that ever since 2008 we're very familiar with, which is too big to fail, right?
Right.
And the club would float their members until they can hand it off to the taxpayer.
Well, that's exactly right. So what happened was, and you got to remember, this is when Glass-Steagall was operative. Now, we talk about the risks that have happened when Glass-Steagall came down, and you had commercial banks, investment banks merging, and the risks inherent in the securities business sort of polluting or infiltrating insured deposits through the FDIC. And we saw in 2008 what the risks of that were. But when you had this separation, you had other risks. And one of those risks was that it was very hard to enter the securities business unless you were already in it. And that was done purposefully. The New York Stock Exchange had a number of rules to keep entrants out. Why? Because they had a monopoly and they wanted to keep their monopoly. You couldn't go public and be an investment bank that's a member of the New York Stock Exchange in those days, really until 1970. You had to have a majority of the revenues that your aggregate business generated in the securities business. So that meant insurance companies and industrial companies couldn't own investment banks. And obviously through Glass-Steagall, commercial banks couldn't own in investment banks. So you had structurally a small capital industry. And with the exception of Merrill Lynch, which grew very large by having its partners keep its money in the business, most of the other investment banks, including some brand names and some of the largest, were really run with a insufficient capital base. Now, as we mentioned, in 1964, you had this explosion of business. And you also had, importantly, the computerization of Wall Street in a very robust and profound way. You could not compete in the mid-1960s on unless you made continuous investments in upgrading your computer systems, and that takes capital. And why make that investment when I can take the money out as partners in these firms and go buy a yacht. So you had incentives that were not really aligned with safe operation. And some of the least well-capitalized firms, or the most poorly capitalized firms, were the most powerful on the board of directors of the New York Stock Exchange. So you had those who were the worst offenders in many ways in the most powerful seats to be regulating themselves.
Talk about some of the more fascinating and or corrupt characters that you write about in your book. For example, well, you pick somebody. Of course, we want to hear about Roy Cohn, but talk about Francine Gottfried.
Yeah, Francine Gottfried wasn't a corrupt individual. She was a victim of what was back then a very sexist industry. It's hard to imagine today. Francine Gottfried was 19, 20-year-old woman who worked at Chase Manhattan as a key punch operator. This was back when many computers still had punch cards. And she worked there, and she was a very attractive young woman. And what happened was a group of men would wait for her to exit the subway each day so they could oogle her. And in 1967, it became such a large group that there were literally tens of thousands of men oogling her as she exited the subway to try to go to work each day. And instead of this being something that was condemned as pretty bad behavior, it became almost a national fad. These men oogling her was featured in newspapers. She was invited to go on The Tonight Show. Hugh Hefner offered to give her a centerfold in Playboy. It was viewed as sort of good, harmless fun. Now, what was interesting was 2 years later, Collar J, who was one of the early feminists, decided to flip the tables. And she and some of her allies at the same subway station on Wall Street started oogling the men and going up and pinching their body parts. And she also had a film crew that followed them around to show how outrageous this behavior was. That was really ordinary course, unfortunately, on Wall Street at the time. And it was through Carla J, who I interviewed for the book, that the modern concepts of sexual harassment became ingrained in our laws. So
now you have powerful women. You have Janet Yellen. Now things are different in this era.
Things are very different. But it's amazing that in your lifetime and mine, that this behavior was considered to be, harmless fun, when of course it was nothing of the sort.
And she found a way to turn the tables.
She did. A very interesting woman, and is still around, and I think still teaching at NYU.
You mentioned briefly the effect of a third-party candidate on the business markets, and the first serious one we saw rise in American politics after Teddy Roosevelt was Ross Perot. How I don't remember.
Well, actually, you could argue it was George Wallace.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. You're exactly right.
Unlike Ross Perot.
But Ross Perot, I mean, the first one that didn't scare the hell out of everybody is what I'm saying.
Right.
But yeah. I mean, I don't remember it because I wasn't paying attention, but did that affect the wall? Because that was like throwing a huge monkey wrench in the system there. Did it affect the markets at all?
It didn't really affect the markets. Now, as you know, Ross Perot is a major character in my book, because he had the idea that because the Wall Street firms had not invested, many of them, in appropriate computer technology, that this created a real opportunity for EDS, which was Ross Perot's firm, which became the hottest high-flyer technology company in the 1960s of this era, because he came up with a way to computerize Medicaid and Medicare and processed all the medical claims. And that made him a very wealthy man. And he saw the disaster of the back offices on Wall Street that were causing. It was really the beginning of the crisis that we talk about in the book because of the failure to invest. And Ross said, "Hey, if I get in on Wall Street, I could do for Wall Street what I did for Medicaid, and I could become effectively the back office operator, the computer operator for all of these financial institutions, and obviously make many billions along the way. What Ross learned, which is what a lot of people learned, is when you go to Wall Street and try to beat the Wall Streeters at their own game, oftentimes it's you that gets fleeced. And Ross Perot ended up losing hundreds of millions of dollars in his foray into Wall Street.
Well, speaking of computers, you also talk about the fact that part of what was wrong with the 60s was outdated technology. I mean, these days we have computer day trading that have completely gone on to dictate the market on any given day. But back then they didn't have all that stuff, right?
No, it's today billions of shares are traded every day on the exchanges in the aggregate. It was a very big day on the New York Stock Exchange if 10 million shares traded in the late 1960s. And 15 or 20 million shares a day overwhelmed the system. Okay. So just to give you a sense of how the technology really changed Wall Street, that number, the average trading volume, gives you a sense of how things had changed. Now, the technology that United States investment banks were using, for the most part, in the late 1960s, were, really 1950s or even 1940s technology.
They also didn't have the foresight to invest in tech. They did not see the future.
Correct.
Exactly.
With a few notable exceptions like Merrill Lynch, which was always committed from very early days to having the best technology, very few of the investment banks followed suit. And when this trading volume exploded, their systems became overwhelmed. Now, another thing to consider is, and this is crazy when you think about it now, but in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, when a share traded, a physical certificate moved. Okay. Now, today, and ever since around 1971, all transactions on public markets are done by computer book entry. There's no physical movement of paper.
Right.
That was not the case then. We still had stock certificates and runners and cages and people. And of course, when you had this explosion in volume beginning in 64, that system became overwhelmed. You would have the same share of stock traded 5 times and still in the name of the previous fifth owner.
And that's when the first bailout took place, because we were so interdependent upon this working.
Correct. And you were obligated to credit the customer who bought it with that stock certificate. And after a while, if you couldn't locate it, you had to go in the market and buy it again.
Oh.
A lot of these banks lost control of their inventory, and their insolvency was also majorly caused by the fact that they had to go out and spend money to correct their inventory problems, right? So you had people credited with stocks they didn't own. You had people charged for margin loans they never borrowed. You had people who did make margin loans, never charged for it. And all of these problems ultimately became hundreds of millions of dollars in the aggregate. Now, something else that happened. Once organized crime in New York, and of course, organized crime in New York in the 1960s was a much bigger economic factor than it is today. Obviously, when Rudy Giuliani came in and Rico came in, that was reduced in magnitude. But this was the heyday of the mafia. And when they learned that the back offices of these Wall Street banks were out of control, they infiltrated it and ended up stealing hundreds of millions of dollars of stocks themselves, which further added to the problem.
These days, mergers and acquisitions are a big part of the conversation on CNBC. I mean, there's one today where Showtime is going to merge with Paramount Plus or whatever the one is. But that seems to be a motivating factor for companies. Just the only way you don't die is to keep getting bigger. But that wasn't the case so much in the 60s, which is what you talk about in the bulk of your book.
Well, it depends which industry you were in. It was not really the case for Wall Street firms. The consolidation really began with this crisis, with firms saying, gee, I don't have enough capital. I need to find someone to marry to sort of bail me out. And the last part of the book talks about those shotgun weddings and how that began the consolidation of what was, for the most part, a mom and pop industry. But there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the 1960s because of people like Charlie Bluthorn at Gulf and Western and IT&T, the conglomerates who thought that I could apply scientific management techniques on companies of any industry, right? Now, this theory was discredited by the market when the stocks of the conglomerates didn't perform all that well, but you would have companies that owned an oil company, motion picture, rail cars, all sorts of disparate industries. And what it really was, in many respects, was an accounting gimmick. Okay.
I worked for one of those companies. I worked for General Electric when I worked for NBC for 40 years. And NBC was purchased by General Electric, and General Electric made jet engines and refrigerators and various things. And they didn't own media companies, but they did what you said. They put their management imprimatur on these media companies, and media doesn't work the way the jet engine factory works.
No.
And because there's a creative factor and all that sort of thing. So it was not a completely successful merger.
No, it ended very badly, as we've seen in the Jeff Immelt era. And there's a school of thought that said really GE's success during the 80s and 90s was driven principally by GE Financial, which was not subject to the same regulation that other banks were. And its aggressive lending practices generated a tremendous amount of earnings for GE. So it was really a hedge fund that owned a bunch of other companies. I'm not sure I buy that theory, but it is certainly one that a number of writers have. There are two good books out now about Jack Welch and the GE era, one by David Gellis, the New York Times, another by Bill Cohan, who is a former banker and also wrote for Vanity Fair's at Puck now. But yes, GE was in many ways the last conglomerate. And the accounting gimmick that worked in this wasn't really a gimmick per se, it was legal. But if my stock traded at 12 times earnings or 20 times earnings, and I do an acquisition of a company that trades at 5 times earnings, if their earnings now get 12 times multiple, I've made money just because I own that company now, even if I do nothing in terms of synergies or upgrading it.
I remember when GE sold the company to Comcast. GE had this, their main goal was to stay a blue chip stock. So they would buy an entity, and the minute that entity's stock slipped below where it was when they purchased it, they dumped it because they didn't want it to taint their blue chip status. So
that gets back to the financial business. Because they had a AAA credit rating, they could borrow extremely cheaply. And if they could then lend that money out at higher rates, you had a very successful operation going on. And GE could borrow cheaper than even the largest banks in the country because it was thought to be so safe and blue chip, as you said.
But the tag to that story is when Comcast bought the company, and as they always do when there's an acquisition, they send one of their representatives out to speak to the newsroom where I worked to assure everybody there won't be mass layoffs. And I'll never forget this guy's speech, and it was such a great description of the way GE does business. He said what I just said to you, that once their stock dips below where their purchase level, they bail on it so they can keep their status. And so when they sold the company, they only had a 25% profit margin in the owned and operated stations. Well, in any other business on the planet, if you have a 25% profit margin, you are in high cotton, my friend. So this guy from Comcast comes in and said, well, GE sold the company because it was only making a 25% profit margin. Comcast comes in and said, we'll take a business with a 25% profit margin. And they bought it and they turned it around. I mean, what greased their wheels was that they were a media entity. So the symbiosis between the news business and their cable operation was better. But it made me laugh, but it was a very interesting awakening to hear him say that. We'll take a business with a 25% profit margin. Crazy.
Yeah. Talk about the role that Roy Cohn, he's an infamous historical figure, and you write about him in your book as being a player on the financial scene in the 60s.
Right. So, after the SEC did its great study in 1963 and passed the amendments to the securities laws in 1964, it started to focus on abuses in the mutual funds. And what the SEC was looking for was a high-profile case to really put the fear of God in the mutual fund industry. And what it found was that Roy Cohn had taken over a company called the Fifth Avenue Coach Lines. I used to say to yourself, why could a bus company be an investment company, a mutual fund? Well, what happened was, as a result of a strike, the city of New York bought the operations of the Fifth Avenue Coach Line, and it basically had a pile of cash. And of course, what Roy Cohn wanted was to get his hands on that pile of cash. And what the company did was it made investments in other activities that were not really of an operating nature. So it was, according to the law, a mutual fund, but it wasn't run with any of the guardrails or corporate governance that a mutual fund is supposed to be run by. And an enormous amount of the money went towards paying Roy Cohn's legal fees and for making investments in companies that were Roy Cohn clients. So
he just needed a little something to do after he put the Rosenbergs to death.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. He was indicted by Bob Morgenthau, who was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York in those days, later to become the Manhattan District Attorney for many years. Roy Cohn was indicted in total 3 times, 2 times with charges related to the Fifth Avenue Coach Line saga, and he beat the rap all 3 times.
Was he his own lawyer?
The fact that he was, and it's amazing, the middle trial, his lawyer had heart trouble, and Roy Cohn came up with the brilliant idea that he would give the closing argument. He, Roy Cohn, rather than a junior lawyer to his counsel. And of course, he didn't testify in the trial, right? He chose to not put himself on the stand. But by giving the closing argument, he effectively had a chance to tell his story to the jury without being subject to cross-examination. Now, Morgenthau as you would imagine, Morgenthau went crazy.
Yeah.
Went to the judge in Wyatt and said, how can you allow this to happen? He can't testify and not be subject to cross-examination. He's the defendant. Well, the judge went through all of the records and said, sorry, there's nothing that can prevent him from giving his own closing argument, even though he didn't take the stand. And Roy Cohn was acquitted. And in the second slew of charges related to the Fifth Avenue Coach Line case, he got 90% of them dismissed and was acquitted on the others in about an hour and a half. And this really created the image of Roy Cohn as the legal executioner, as the man who could beat the government. And that's what got him clients such as Fred Trump and Donald Trump, Cy Newhouse, the New York Archdiocese, all 5 of the New York Mafia families. When you beat Bob Morgenthau 3 times, and particularly in such dramatic fashion with such bold moves, that has a habit to get people's attention. So ironically, his criminal acts became his most success's advertisement for business.
Wow. That's
alleged criminal acts.
Alleged, yes. Yeah. But I mean that kind of like is the New York model of just being a badass where, you make everything illegal look kind of legal because you got away with it, or mob-like. I don't know why we respect those types of badasses. Or there's TV shows.
Street fighters, yeah.
Yeah, street fighters, yeah,
well,
exactly.
Right. I mean, look, there's no question that Roy Cohn was a genius.
Sure.
To come up with that idea takes a special kind of intelligence. But also, he would do anything to win. And even respectable, quote unquote, clients wanted Roy Cohn because they knew that if it were a life and death type situation, a bet the company type litigation, that Roy Cohn would make sure that no stone was unturned.
Did you see that documentary, Where's My Roy Cohn, on Netflix?
I did.
So
Yeah.
good. So interesting.
Yeah. And it became, and also because he was so ruthless, his tactics, he was not afraid about being shunned by polite society or the New York Bar Association. He just didn't care. And when you're dealing with someone who doesn't care, I mean, he would leak whatever it took to Cindy Adams in the New York Post, and he would leak things to Page Six, and he would just engage in the most brutal tactics.
He created a template for Donald Trump, and when you have no shame, there's nothing you won't stoop to.
And it became that, just a letter from Roy Cohn saying, I'm representing so-and-so, resulted in settlement of 95% of the matters that Roy Cohn was involved in, because it wasn't just his skill in the courtroom. It was the fact that there would be private investigators crawling through your mail, and every sort of hardball tactic would be used against you.
Well, you said something in your book that I've heard guys on CNBC say when when the talking heads are questioning an economist, the economist always says, "In my business, nobody knows anything."
Right.
Which is perfect.
Well,
when somebody is asked to make a prediction, he said, "In my business, nobody knows anything."
Well, that was a line from Marshall Kogan, who was an investment banker during those days with an upstart firm that had purchased Hayden Stone, which was an old line firm that went bankrupt. And the point he was making there was that we all had thought that there was a room somewhere where a bunch of wise men and wise women are keeping track of what was going on and making sure that the system was running smoothly. And he said, in fact, no such controls existed. And nobody really knew what was going on Wall Street. And he was a very young man at the time, that he and his partner was Sandy Weil, who later became the chairman of Citigroup. And that, a few young guys very quickly became owners of some of the largest investment banks in America because they were, better capitalized, had good technology, and were very smart. And they did not have a lot of respect for the old guard, and that they thought they knew as much as they did. In fact, they did.
And what do we learn from the 60s that informs us moving forward?
Well, number one, that you have to be very skeptical about self-regulation. You really need gatekeepers. And one of the problems I think that was involved in the Madoff situation was sort of the revolving door, right? Where, if you're at the SEC for a few years, you could become general counsel of a Wall Street firm. And if you threw too many punches, maybe that was going to hurt your career advancement.
Yep.
Or, what was very prevalent in the 1960s was investment banking being intertwined with political figures through fundraising and through serving in their administrations. Now, when Wall Street, which had hid the fact that so many of its large firms were insolvent in 1968 and 1969, came to the realization that the problem was out of control. They couldn't bail themselves out, and they had to go to Washington. Well, they had some interesting allies in 1970. One was the chairman of the Democratic Party was Larry O'Brien. And Larry O'Brien, before he became chairman in 1969-70, was the CEO of McDonald and Company, which was the first large investment bank to fail during the crisis. Okay. And President Nixon's chief economic advisor, Peter Flanagan, was the husband of one of the members of the McDonald family. So they not only had the chairman of the Democratic Party intimately involved with the investment bank, they also had Nixon's chief economic advisor. Maurice Stans, who was the Secretary of Commerce under Nixon, was CEO of Glorforgan, one of the large investment banks that was insolvent and failed. Bill Casey, who would become chairman of the SEC in 71 and later director of the CIA, was the tax lawyer for many of these firms. And it was a bipartisan type of soft corruption. They were intertwined on both sides of the aisle. So when they came to Washington for their bailout, nobody wanted detailed hearings where you were going to go through and uncover what went wrong, because both Democrats and Republicans would have looked very bad had there been a Pecora hearings type, type proceeding like you saw after the stock market crash in 29. Nobody wanted that.
I hope we would have learned something since the 60s, and I hope we would have learned something since 2008. But when they push back and caused to evaporate the Elizabeth Warren Consumer Protection Agency, that made me really mad. I thought that was a great step forward, maybe because she was a little bit too radical for the business community, but I just thought, well, we were making some headway, and then that happened.
Well, I think, and again, I'm certainly not in the Elizabeth Warren camp of regulation, I'll disclose right away. But I think more importantly than a rash of new laws and regulations is vigorous enforcement of the laws you have on the books. And it is impossible to police Wall Street without vigilant and aggressive regulation and oversight from Washington, from the SEC, from the Fed, from the OCC. The laws are on the books. I mean, there was nothing here where you said in 1970, well, gee, there was a gap in the regulatory regime. No, you had a net capital rule, which would have shut down all of these investment banks had it been applied. But what had happened was a figure you probably never heard of, a man by the name of John Coleman, who was one of the most important individuals on Wall Street and, frankly, in the nation during the 1940s and 50s and 60s. He had supported FDR in 1940 for a third term. Not many folks on Wall Street did. And he was also chairman of the New York Stock Exchange in the 40s. And he asked one favor from FDR, and that was, when the SEC adopts this net capital rule, could you have the New York Stock Exchange enforce it for its members rather than the SEC? And that exception was agreed to. And that was really the original sin of all of this.
Self-regulation, which you said was a bad idea.
1940. It was an undermining of regulation by delegating to the New York Stock Exchange what should have been and ultimately became the purview of the SEC and not the industry itself regulating itself.
Was this your dad, Fritz? Joseph?
Oh, no. My father was blue collar.
Okay.
Well, this is a great book, Richard. We really appreciate your time. And you wrote one previous to this, another Wall Street book. What was the title?
Right.
What was the title?
Wall Street Wars. It was about the beginning of regulation of Wall Street by Washington. Until the 1930s, the federal government had no involvement in regulating Wall Street. It was all done by New York State. And that began the federal government involvement. Obviously started with the stock market crash and then the Pecora hearings. And out of that came Glass-Steagall and the Securities Acts and the Securities and Exchange Commission.
All right. Well, this book is fascinating. It's called Gonzo Wall Street, Riots, Radicals, Racism, and Revolution, How the Go-Go Bankers of the 60s Crashed the Financial System and Bamboozled Wall Street. You know, as I said about...
Bamboozled Washington.
Bamboozled Washington.
Right. And I use the same expression I did when talking about the Abraham Lincoln book. Past this prologue, we learn about our current economic situation. And if you were affected by the 2008 crash, it's not the first time that sort of system was set up. But Richard,
no, this was the first time where, because again, after those laws were passed in the 1930s, Glass-Steagall, the commercial banking, your savings account was protected. But securities business, stock trading, et cetera, you were on your own. Washington was not going to bail you out if you were in that business or you lost money in that business. This was the first time, 1970, when Washington bailed out the securities industry. And that crossing over into risk-based activities on Wall Street and putting them within the umbrella of the taxpayer, that was the beginning of Too Big to Fail and what we saw in 2008.
Well,
it all
great book.
began here.
And we just appreciate your conversation with us, Richard. Thank you so much.
Anytime. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Of course. Here come your closing credits. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love
My pleasure.
We would love to continue this conversation with you on Instagram and Twitter, where we are at MediaPath Pod, and on Facebook, where our show page is MediaPath Podcast, and our Facebook group is MediaPath with Fritz and Wheezy Podcast Community. You can find full video podcast episodes loaded with bonus visual content on our YouTube channel, MediaPath Podcast. And you can write to us at MediaPathPodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy this show, please give us a nice rating in Apple Podcasts and 5 stars, and talk about us, if you would, on social media. You can sign up for our saucy rag of a newsletter at MediaPathPodcast.com. We want to thank our guests, Richard E. Farley, Diane Bay, and Lee Purcell. Our team includes Dina Friedman, John Maddox, Sharon Bellio, Bill Filipiak, Thomas Hubble, Mason Brown, Garrett Arch, and you. Our theme music is by me and John Maddox. I am Louise Palanker, here with Fritz Coleman, and we will see you along the media path.
Richard, thank you very much. Great stories in there.
Great book.
Sorry.
Congratulations.
Where are we talking to you? Are you in New York now?